I want to help you make your writing process more fun. And by that I mean the specific process of actually writing your novel, movie, comic book, whatever writing project you have. Because odds are if you're watching this, you already really like the stage of coming up with the story, the brainstorming stage, where you're walking around in your daily life or as you're going to bed or waking up in the morning and story ideas are coming to you for some passion project that you're really excited about, but the actual getting into the writing process might be a bit of a struggle for you. I know it definitely used to be for me. I would spend so long planning out a project and getting really hyped about making it amazing, but then I would get really nervous about actually stepping into writing the thing. Or sometimes when I actually would sit down to write it, it would turn out that I'd spent so long planning out the story that I knew so much about what was going to happen in it that by the time I was actually writing it, I was kind of bored of the story already. That is a problem I used to have, but definitely do not have now. For the last 5 years, I've been self-employed as a writer and illustrator, making videos on this channel, writing lots and lots of fiction, and specifically as I've shifted into doing more original stories lately, over the last 5 months or so, I've been putting out about an hour of audiobook content every week. And that's not using some kind of AI trickery or anything. I write the whole story myself, I record the story of me saying it, not an AI voice saying it, I do the art, all that stuff. I put it all together myself. And specifically, the thing that prompted me to make this video is last week, I wrote the almost 16,000 word finale to my audiobook series Vigilance in about a day and a half. So needless to say, I've gotten really good at actually finishing the writing projects that I start. And a lot of the time, I'd say most of the time, I do genuinely enjoy my writing process. And I want to help you feel the same way. Near the beginning, I'll give a bunch of different tips and tricks that have been really helpful for me, and then the core of this video is going to be me going through 3 different writing processes that you could use, and I highly recommend you listen to all of them. And I'm not just saying that as a YouTube-y thing, like, you know, if more people watch through the whole video, it does better and the algorithm gets promoted more. I mean because my point of this video isn't for you to try and adapt all of them at once and overwhelm yourself trying to take on so many things, but as you listen to the different ones, and specifically the 3 different workflows, your intuition is probably going to latch on to one specifically that just feels really right to you. There's no one single correct writing process that every writer is going to do a really great job with and going to produce the best results with. One of the methods I'm going to talk about is my specific method that I use now that works great for me, but another of them is one that I used a long time ago that I thought worked for me back then, but it turned out there was something that worked better for me. But that one may be the perfect one for you. I'll have everything time-coded if you do want to jump around, but again, I highly recommend you just listen through to everything. Starting off with the more basic tips and tricks. Now, full transparency, structurally it would make more sense to put these tips and tricks after we've gone through the different workflows and you've picked one that you think will work for you. But I know this is YouTube, videos tend to have drop-off of viewership as the video goes along, and I think there's a lot of really great ideas in here that even if you just take one of them away, could really help your writing process. So I'd rather shotgun out these tips and tricks right off the start, and then we'll get more into the meat of the different writing processes. The first tip in this video is my personal absolute favorite, and it's adapted from something I read from James Clear, the author of Atomic Habits, and it's basically a way to trick you into doing more writing. Again, once you've got a workflow picked out from the 3 that I'll go through later, it'll be easier to get out of the brainstorming stage and into the actual writing. But once you are in that writing stage, I highly recommend try committing to writing just 3 sentences a day, or even pick 5 days a week where you commit to sitting down and writing just 3 sentences. And the reason I'm saying 3 sentences is because once you get yourself into a position to actually write, once you write 3 sentences of your story, odds are you're going to keep going. If you do genuinely want to be a storyteller and you haven't bored yourself like I used to, doing way too much pre-planning, then once you write 3 sentences, even if they're not even great 3 sentences, you're gonna get into the flow and write a lot more, maybe a few paragraphs, a few pages, or even an entire chapter. And it all comes from tricking yourself into thinking that you don't even have to be that disciplined to do this because you're just committing to writing 3 sentences. They don't even have to be final sentences that are in the finished product. You could end up rewriting everything you wrote that day or doing a significant amount of edits. But just committing to getting you into writing 3 sentences a day is probably going to mean you're going to write a whole lot more than that. And I would recommend pick a time in your day where you know you have a bit more time after those 3 sentences are done, so that if you do get into flow, which is the hope, then you can just keep going and write a lot more. The second tip is another thing to help you get into flow really quickly when you're getting into your writing, finishing it one day and going into it the next. And it's adapted from something I read from Ernest Hemingway, world famous author, which is that when you're finishing your writing for a day, finish halfway through a paragraph or sentence or idea. Basically, don't write everything that you know down on the page, then leave it, because then the next day when you come back, if you have a sentence unfinished, you know exactly how you want that sentence to finish, and then you can pick back up into flow really easily again. If you stop at a point where you don't know what's happening next, it might be harder to get into the next day. It's not necessarily a problem, it's a good thing that you can work to overcome, and maybe some great ideas will come to you overnight, but still, it's a lot easier to get back in that flow if you've got a half-finished sentence there that you already know how to finish. The third suggestion is something I heard this week from Margaret Atwood, and I believe she was talking specifically about once you're in the editing process, but I think this is something that could work really well at any stage once you've started writing the actual project, and that is to read out loud what you've written. Now, obviously, I'm a bit biased, and I was glad to see that that's advice she gives because I'm pretty much always writing stuff to be presented out loud, so I'm already reading stuff out loud multiple times in my own writing process. But you're much more likely to figure out what's wrong with something you've written if you've got this idea in your head that something about this isn't working, then reading it out loud is so much more likely to help you find what it is that isn't working. Plus, you'll just be able to figure out if a sentence is flowing nicely. You know, when you read it on the page, it might seem fine, but then you read it out loud and you're like, oh, that is a little bit janky and weird. So if you're struggling with a section of your book even before you get into editing, highly recommend. Just read that paragraph or page out loud and you're very likely to find out what it is that you're not liking about it. The fourth tip is just about limiting beliefs that a lot of people have around writing or really any kind of art or probably beyond to different professions. And that is the idea of the professional being a very intimidating title. Being a professional writer is probably not nearly as hard as you're making it out to be in your head. To be a professional author, you don't have to be Suzanne Collins making the Hunger Games books. It just means you're earning money off of the stuff that you're writing. And I would be willing to bet there are some writers significantly worse at writing than you making a living off of their writing. If we switch this over to talking about illustrations and animations, look at some of the stuff that I was making a living drawing and animating 6 or 7 years ago. This is not like Marvel Comics, DC Comics grade stuff or Disney animation. You don't have to be ridiculously incredible at something to become a professional at it. And whatever level you're at now, every other writer has probably been at that level. And the way you're going to keep getting better and better is just by writing more and more. So even if you're writing something and thinking to yourself, oh, this is really not good, just keep writing, because as you're writing something, even if it's bad, you're going to be learning what's bad about it and actively improving with every single project. Basically, this tip is just to take a lot of pressure off yourself. As someone who's been making a living off his writing and illustrations, and if we go all the way back to animations for over a decade now, as much as I absolutely love this job, it's not that special, if you know what I mean. Like, now that I'm in it and making a living off of it, it just feels really normal. And if you keep going, you are going to get to that stage as well, where it just feels like a normal part of life to make a living off stuff you love. The final tip I want to give kind of just plays off that last one, so I don't even know if I can call it its own separate tip. I've kind of said it already, but that's to remember that every single project you write, as much as you do want to make it as good as you possibly can right now, every single one is practice for the next one. It's better to get into the habit of finishing projects and then putting them out into the world, seeing how other people respond, and even just seeing how you respond to them a week or a month after you've finished them, and then take those lessons and move on to the next project and make that one even better. I mean, even just on a practical level, we do live in a time period where content is just being churned out, and there are people who are writing books using AI now. So yes, you could spend a decade trying to make the perfect novel or screenplay or comic, and first of all, odds are you're never going to consider a project you make to be perfect. There's always going to be something you think you could improve, but the more stuff that you can finish and reflect on and be 90% happy with and put out into the world, the higher your chances are that people are going to find your work, read it, watch it, enjoy it, and then go back to your other projects and be excited for your next ones, which will be even better. And just kind of bouncing off of that on the topic of AI, I think it's always good to remember that no matter what time period or industry you're in, there's always going to be a boogeyman looming that people point to and say, oh, we're in huge trouble because this thing's here. Right now, AI's the boogeyman, but once AI stops being that, another boogeyman will pop up, and every minute you spend being afraid of the boogeyman is time you're not spending improving on your passion and getting better at writing, or art, or whatever it is that you want to be great at. The boogeyman's always going to be there, but it's your choice whether you let it waste your time and kill your mood. Now, with all of that said, we can move into the actual different writing processes. Starting off with the one that I personally use nowadays and have been using for a few years now, so because it's my personal one, I'm gonna arrogantly call it the just right method. Because in a Goldilocks sort of fashion, the 3 different writing processes I'm going to talk about, for me personally, one of them has too much planning, one of them has not enough planning, and then the one I'm going to talk about first is the just right method. But again, that's my personal bias. One of the other ones may be the perfect workflow for you. Now, the just right method admittedly did come about partially from necessity, because I've been putting out 2 videos a week for sometimes even 3 videos a week for years and years now. I did need a process that was faster than my old one, but it also is genuinely my favorite way to write, because it feels like I'm discovering the story as I'm writing it. Like, I'll map out the basic beats and the important scenes, and I'll know going into it and have brainstormed out what is most important, like what the thesis of the story is. I'll know it's either the main character's arc or secondary character's arc, or if there's something about the plot and lore that I really want to get across to people, or even if I want to build the story around a fun, exciting set of action scenes or some comedy beats. This method helps me know the most important stuff and have that planned out without knowing how it all fits together, so that when I'm writing the story, it almost feels more like I'm reading it, which makes it really exciting because it's like going to watch a movie or read a book or whatever about characters that I've created. It's really fun getting to discover the story while also having enough planned out that I'm not getting totally lost and confused and going off on tons of tangents that aren't relevant to the story I'm trying to tell. So this process will start out in a way that I imagine starts out for lots of you, where the idea will just kind of come to me for a story. As I'm walking about in my daily life or doing whatever, I go for a walk once a day, and usually a 10-minute walk after meals, and I'll often have instrumental music playing in my ears or just nothing, so that's usually when stories will come to me the most, and just something will come up and I'll be like, oh, that's really interesting. Often based around some kind of emotional experience I've gone through in my personal life that I think could make an interesting arc for a character. And then I'll let that idea keep spinning for a little while, not too long, but I'll start thinking out different possibilities of how that story could go, if there should maybe be a different main character, where it should be set. If there's a specific one of my characters that would work best to have this character arc, maybe I'll try thinking about if I could tell that from a different character's perspective. All this stuff will kind of be going, and then I'll know that it's time to do a proper formal brainstorming session where I'm actually writing things down once the same ideas have gone through my head a few times, and it's kind of like I've locked on to the main purpose of this story. That's when I go, okay, it's time to properly brainstorm this out. That one, it's a little bit harder to say how much time you should spend on that, but for me, it's probably a lot of the time about a week or something if that story has been kicking around in my head. That's when I sit down and do the proper formal brainstorming session. Now, I have a personal brainstorming journal that I use, which is just a Google Docs document, and I'll add a date for what brainstorming session I'm doing and usually label what story I'm brainstorming. I can't scrub through the entire thing because there's tons of spoilers in there for my current series Mythal Lethal and the Summoner's Beasts, and my upcoming ones like Starseed Psyche and Fear of the Demon Hunters, and my Trismegistus Academy arc, and yes, this is kind of me just doing a little bit of shameless marketing plugged into this episode to talk about all the different series that I have coming out on my YouTube channel. If you like listening to fiction, you might enjoy those. I'll have the ones that are running or finished linked in the description. But anyway, I will show you the brainstorming that I did for a recent chapter of the Summoner's Beast, which was called Archon Family Meeting. Now, this one, being a chapter of an ongoing series, was more based around a really cool action scene that I wanted to both write and draw, and also progressing the plot forward and giving some more hints of tense situations that are going to be coming up. Usually those aren't my favorite kinds of stories. Usually I enjoy the stuff revolving around a character arc more, but this was still a chapter that I was super excited to write. And you can see on screen now how I lay out my brainstorming. It's just kind of notes in little paragraphs about the most important scenes. And something that, if you've watched that episode, you might be noticing, this isn't exactly how the story ended up going. This was what I thought was the most important stuff and the flow of the story when I was in brainstorming. But I was also open to the fact that once I got into writing, things could change or be rearranged or have scenes go differently. But I am still mapping out the most important beats of the story so that I have something to go between. Like, I'll write that first scene and then know the next thing that I'm trying to get to, and also know the overall most important things for a story. But because I'm not meticulously mapping out how we get from each different situation, it ends up having that feeling once I get into writing of, oh, I'm discovering this story. I'm reading it happen more than writing it happen. Then after I've done one or maybe two formal brainstorming sessions where I write down the most important beats of the plot and story and have often a thesis for the story written if there's a specific character arc as the main structure, then I'll let myself have a day or two more where the idea is kind of kicking around my head as I'm walking around in case any other really interesting idea comes to me. Again, this is also based on the fact that I've been putting out 2 videos a week, so a lot of the time I don't have more time that I can put into, marinating on the project. But again, this has also been a lot better for me because it's meant that I don't get bored of a project before I actually get into the writing stage. And then I do it. I get into the actual writing. And again, this is where you can dip back to the stuff I said at the beginning. Specifically, I highly recommend the committing to writing 3 sentences a day. It's easier for me because I have very specific deadlines and I literally have to get the stuff done at a certain point, and I have a very specific schedule for when I'm doing my writing, and I have an audience waiting to see my writing, so there's a lot of things that make being disciplined about it more easy. You might have to push yourself a little bit more, but once you start getting into a writing workflow that works for you, the more you do it and the more you use that workflow, it's just going to become easier and easier and easier, and eventually it's just going to feel like you're not even being disciplined to make yourself write. You're just going to be excited about getting into writing. Then my editing stage for this process is also my rehearsal for doing the audio version of it, where I read the whole story out loud and then go through and, as I'm doing that, see what works, what doesn't, make some changes, maybe add a scene, change the phrasing of different things, basically figuring out what other additions or changes need to put in there for the story to flow and be as comprehensive and fun and exciting as possible. Then again, I'll actually hit record and reread the entire thing out loud one more time where I'm actually recording the audio, and even as I'm doing that, I'll be open to making changes, seeing sentences that I didn't catch in the first edit that need to be changed if the flow isn't great, and sometimes again, even adding extra scenes or just lines of dialogue, things like that. I personally very rarely do a full second draft of a story, because again, I found when I do that in the past, I end up just getting kind of bored of the story unless there is a big significant change, like I've decided in writing the first draft that, oh, this story would actually be a lot better if I wrote it from a different character's perspective. Then it's fresh enough that writing a full nother draft doesn't feel tedious. And I used to think that I needed to do 2 or 3 drafts of a story to be a quote-unquote real writer. But this is just another good reminder that there's no single formula for being a real writer. Early on when you're still improving, maybe you will need to do multiple drafts of things, but odds are you're going to get to a point where doing so wouldn't even necessarily make things much better than just doing a couple edits of the story. But that does kind of lead us into the next writing process, which I believe I heard Jordan Peele talk about as his process, the director of Get Out and Nope and movies like that, but I couldn't find the specific interview where I recalled him saying that, so maybe this was someone else, but odds are tons of different writers use this method. And I don't mean this as an insult, but I'm going to refer to this one as the word vomit method, which will be clear why in a sec. See, with this method, what you're essentially doing is just jumping straight past any formal brainstorming stage. Like once that idea has started kicking around in your head and you've got a few different notions of some scenes or characters or what's important, you don't do brainstorming, you literally just jump right in to writing immediately and get all of your ideas out, knowing that this first draft it's incredibly unlikely that it's going to be really good or even understandable to someone reading it, unless you're really channeling something through you or you're some kind of writing prodigy. But the idea is to get all of your ideas out there for this story, see what comes up, what ideas come to you as you're in the process of just word vomiting the entire thing out. And then once you've done that and you've got a probably pretty sloppy first draft, then you go back and read through it, preferably reading it out loud, and take notes on what works, what doesn't, what is completely unnecessary, what needs to be added, what characters should be changed, or how their arc should be paced out differently. Basically, going through and sifting through the duds, finding the gold in what you just threw out there onto the page. And then once you've done that, that almost becomes like your brainstorming session partway through the writing process. And then you go in and write that second draft knowing what is actually important about this story and how to make it flow in the way you want. I don't actually know if I've used this workflow before. I feel like I probably have in university with a couple different creative writing projects or something. Again, it's not my personal thing. I do see lots of benefits in it, but if that sounded really appealing to you, then I highly recommend trying it out. And as a little cut-in before we get to the third writing process option, and these aren't the only 3 out there, these are just the 3 that I'm laying out to you, I want to suggest that you don't just try it on 1 or 2 days, then give up on it if it's not working right away. Decide which one sounds best to you, then commit to trying it for a full project or for a few weeks or a month. Just because something doesn't work for you right away, that doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't work for you overall. It just means you're still getting into the flow of trying it out. Maybe you'll end up picking one that isn't ultimately the right workflow for you, but you'll only really know if you give it some time and try settling into it and see how it feels when you're actually writing a project with that method. And now we will get into the third writing process, which doesn't have as fun of a name, I guess. I'm just calling it the Careful Planner method. Now, the Careful Planner method, as you may have guessed from the name, is the one that involves the most planning before you actually get into the writing process. It's one that I personally used way back in the day, about a decade ago, when I was doing a little book series called Multiverse Tales, and I was illustrating and self-publishing it as well, and my audience now knows it as a series that I eventually rebooted about 4 or 5 years ago, starting with Biomet Kayla, and now has like 60 episodes or something like that. And I've earned significantly more money off of it now than I did back when I tried self-publishing it back in the day. I would also say my art now is way better, and my storytelling is definitely significantly better too, though I went back to those stories semi-recently and I was like, these kinda hold up. And part of that is because of this method that I used. I don't use it anymore, but it does work, and may be the best method for people that are earliest in their writing development. But again, if it doesn't sound like it resonates to you as much as some of the other ones, by all means, go with the other ones. But for this one, after you've done your initial, letting the idea spin around in your head for a while, maybe even done a few notes of brainstorming, you go and download a story writing template that will actually give you space to lay out the main important points of the story, the acts, the scenes within those acts, the important things within each of those scenes, map out all of the characters and their backstories. Some of them are less elaborate, some of them are more elaborate. There's tons of them out there. A lot of them you have to pay for, but I have found one that seems really intriguing and has tons of room for details that if you don't want to get as involved as this one is showing, you can just leave out some of the things in your brainstorming process. I don't personally remember the one that I used back in the day when I did Multiverse Tales. I do remember that one being good, and I would link to it if I had it. If I find it, I'll add it to the description at some point. But again, it doesn't really matter which one you use. Any of these templates can be good, and if you don't like this one, you can go looking for another one. Lots of people charge for them, but it's probably not more than a few bucks. But the one that I'm linking in the description is free, and it does seem like it would be very useful. Now, why this might work particularly well for you is if you're not like me, and you don't have the risk of getting bored of your story, having everything so planned out can really help you just flow through the writing process really quickly. You don't have to get lost in, wait, how am I getting from here to here? Because you have all of the scenes mapped out already. Possible downsides for this is it can make the story feel a little bit too cookie cutter, a little bit too formulaic, but again, a lot of story writing templates are based on formulas that work really, really well and have a proven track record of centuries old of working well for telling stories. So again, if you're a bit unsure about your story writing skills and possibly get nervous that you don't know your story well enough before getting into writing, this might be the right process for you to have it all planned out before actually getting into it. Then there's not very much to worry about. And, well, that was the third process. I really hope that one of them jumped out to you the most as the one that feels right for you and that you give it a try. But remember, ultimately, at the end of the day, the most important thing is just to convince yourself to start writing more. There are still plenty of times where I wake up in the morning and I know the first thing I need to do is the writing for a story, and I sit down and I just kind of get a little grumbly and I'm like, I don't know if I want to get into the writing right now. Is there something else I could do? But then once I get into even just the first sentence and I get that down and get into flow, sometimes half a day can disappear and I'll have written the whole story. And that largely came about by finding a writing process that worked for me, but also just from being disciplined enough to know that I need to sit down and start writing, and that in a lot of cases, once I start, it's hard to stop. I really hope you can get to the same place with your writing because it's a super fun place to be. And I'm very curious if people would be interested in more videos like this. If you're a fan of this channel, you know this isn't the kind of video that I usually make. And admittedly, part of the reason this video is happening is because after I did that massive Vigilance finale last week, I was a bit creatively drained, and this idea had come to me a while back. I actually have thought about making a course or series of videos called Writing for Illustrators, because this channel got popular more based on my illustration work than my story writing, but I actually learned to be a good writer before I ever learned to be a good illustrator, because I thought I wanted to be a screenwriter back in university. Then I did the Multiverse Tales books way back when. And anyway, the point is I have lots of other writing advice that I think could be useful to people, and if you have some specific advice that you'd like me to talk about or make a video about, let me know in the comments. And if you are new to this channel and you want to see some examples of my writing, I highly recommend some of my ongoing series like Vigilance, which just wrapped up, which is focused around a superhero fighting league and is a semi-anthology series, with the different characters' arcs usually having an underpinning of mental health advice that's been super useful to me personally in my real life. Or I have other ongoing series like Mytholethal, which is more action and mythology based, or The Summoner's Beasts, or you could go all the way back to the start of Multiverse Tales, with Biomet Kayla as the first episode. I think my voice presentation is much better nowadays than it was when I first started Multiverse Tales, but I think a lot of those old episodes do still hold up really well. Anyway, I love you all. I hope there was a lot of useful information in this episode. I feel like there was a lot of positive and inspiring notes worked in throughout the episode, so I don't know if I really need to end on another one. But I guess the last thing that's kind of coming to me is just a reminder that being a real writer or professional writer isn't as big and flashy of a thing as you might have it in your head. It's a thing that anyone can do with enough work and dedication, and that's obviously a lot easier when you start having more fun with your writing process, which I hope you do start having more fun with it as of today. I'll see you in the next video on Friday. Goodbye.